Chapter 35, R1-Vav Yod Verbs. For Chapter 35 and the next two chapters, we're going to look at the weakness of the Vav in a root. This is the R1-Vav Yod, and then the next chapter, of course, will be the R2-Vav Yod, and the third chapter will be the R3-Vav Yod. The weakness, of course, of the Vav is that it can sometimes, and the Yod is they can sometimes disappear, they sometimes contract, and so they have certain problems that we have to watch very closely. Now, when you're looking at a R1 Yod verb, for instance, you think of a word like yashav. When you see a verb like this, you really could be looking at one of two verbs. You really could be looking at an R1-Vav verb, where really the first letter was originally a Vav, and later it was changed to a Yod for certain forms like the call perfect. But also you have certain roots like yatav. With yatav, the original first letter was a Yod, not a Vav. And so we really have two types of verbs that we're going to look at here. The R1 Yod that were originally Vavs, and then the R1 Yod that was originally a Yod, as we see here with Yatav. Okay, the first one we're going to look at, if you look at Chapter 35, Section 2, we're going to look at R1 Yod, but original Vav. These are far more common in Hebrew than the Yods, and so we'll start with that. Again, the problems we have, we'll first look at the weaknesses or the sicknesses. And the first problems you're going to see with these verbs is the fact that the Vav at the beginning somehow will change. It will either fall out, but oftentimes what it will do is contract with the preceding short vowel. So that's going to be the problem of an original Vav. Now, there are certain areas that are strong. And if you look at Section 3, you'll see that there's parts of the verb that is well. If you look, for instance, at the example I give you, of a nifal imperfect 3ms. The root is yalad, but it's really valad, and you can see it here. The vav here is alive and well. You can see it. It's the R1 letter, and the dagish forte in it, of course, is preserving it from being changed into a Yod or being contracted or anything like this. And so really this is just like a strong form here, except that we really do see the original Vav here in this example. Other forms that we can see the original Vav, all it is the Vav is replaced by a Yod. And again, you'll see this in a form that I've written up here already, namely Yashav. In this form here, the original Vav, again, originally, you would have a Vav here, but that Vav was replaced by a Yod. And so we say not Vashav, but Yashav. And this is also true, as I list here, the Piel, Pual, and Hithpael at times can also replace the original Vav with a Yod. So there are some areas that are strong, or at least fairly strong. Now let's look at the remedies of the problems. You have that weakness of the Vav, and due to that weakness we're going to have certain contractions, and that's what we want to look at first. And so if you look at Section 4 of Chapter 35, you'll see the first contraction with the hafal. The hafal actually is a hufal, and so if we will write first the restored original form, the restored original form would look like this. And you can see we have a kibbutz under the preformative he. And then here's the original Vav with the silent shva for the hafal. But we call it a hufal because, again, this kibbutz is really more of a U than an O, and so we call it a hufal. But what happens is when these two get together, there's going to be a contraction. And so UW is going to become a shurek. And so we're going to end up with a contracted form like this, hu shav. And so for the hafal, it will become a hufal, and you're going to have contraction, and you're going to end up with this shurek after the performative. And of course, if you had an imperfect, instead of having the hey, obviously, you would simply have an aton letter here at the beginning. So the first thing we want to do is contract UW to long U, to a shurek. Next, we want to look at the hifil. And with the hifil, as you remember with a strong verb, is a hifil in the perfect. But outside of the perfect, it's really a hafil. But this time, when we're dealing with the hifil of a R1-Vav verb, really what we're going to have is a hafil throughout. This includes the perfect. So even the perfect is now going to be a hafil. And so again, let's write the original form. The original form would look like this. And again, you can see we've got the original Vav. And you can see it's a hafil, so instead of putting a hirik, we put a patach under the performative hey. But this is ow going to o. This is a contraction that you learned chapters back. And so this AW, again, will contract into an O. And so what we will get is this. Ow going to O. And so we will say ho shev, as I've written here. And so again, this is how the hifil will contract. And again, if we were to make an imperfect, we would replace it with an aton letter like this. And any other performative, we would again do the same thing. Now we want to go to a nifal. And now for the first time, a nifal is also going to be a nafal. And this nafal is going to be in the perfect and in the participle. And then, of course, one option of the infinitive absolute. But so let's look at the example that I give. Again, it's going to look this way. And what's going to happen is, again, this now is going to go to no. And so we're going to contract this out. And so now goes to no, just like that. And again, AW becoming a Vav, as you see here. And so again, a nifal really becomes a nafal. And I guess, again, this would be in the perfect and also in the participle. Of course, the participle would simply have an irreducible long comets. And then, of course, one of the options of the infinitive absolute. So we have to watch for those contractions. Those contractions are very important. But of course, as always, the problem really resides in the call. And so let's look at the call. We want to first of all look at the imperfect. And so we'll first restore, again, the protoform as we would expect it. And we would expect it something like this for the protoform. And what happens here is that the original Vav quiesces, disappears, and of course there's going to be a compensation to the form for doing this, and therefore the original hirik under the performative now becomes a seirei, and you say yay, shave. I'll move this over just a little bit. And so the original Vav disappears, and what we have is the short hirik now lengthening to a seirei. Again, this somewhat resembles your R1 noons with the Vav disappearing, kind of going AWOL. And again, even though in the R1 noon that we have assimilation in the imperfect, if you remember in the imperative, of course, it goes AWOL. And so for these original Vav verbs, in the call imperfect, the Vav will disappear, go AWOL on us, and then we will lengthen by compensation the performative vowel. When we go to the imperative, it is identical to the R1 noon verb. And so again, what you would perhaps what we would expect is a form like this with the Vav with the silent schwa. But again, it will go AWOL. And when it goes AWOL, it's going to be simply shave. And as you look at your textbook, you'll see that I have it, an R1 noon verb next to it, tain, both of them having the seirei thematic vowel. And again, these original Vav verbs are again probably showing an original biliteral root, again like Natan for the R1 noon. And if we put a 2FS on it for the imperative, of course we're going to have reduction like this, and you can see the other forms there. For the infinitive construct, again, it will be very similar to the R1 noon verbs. And so what will happen is that the original Vav will again disappear, will go. And then what we will do is we will add that tav that we added for the R1 noon verbs. And then what that will do is, of course, give us a seglet-looking formation. And so when the seglet process takes effect, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to add a segol here. And then you know the kudzu gets out of hand, and once that gets out of hand, the segols are everywhere. And we're going to have an I-class seglet here, just like, again, safer. And so when we put a pronominal suffix on this, it's going to look like this, shiv-t. And therefore, again, this is like a singular seglet pattern for this one. And of course, yes, the accent would shift down to the end of the word. So shiv-t is what we have here. Okay. Now, we also have a verb that's very common in Hebrew that we want to look at, and that is yada. And again, it's an original Vav. So originally we have a Vav here. It's really originally vada, but it's replaced by the yod. And it's doubly weak. It's original Vav at the beginning, but it's a guttural at the end. And therefore, it's going to be a little different when it does the seglet pattern. It's going to be an A-class seglet pattern. And what we're going to have here is a guttural as your R2, and again, this would be like na'ar. And therefore, when we put the pronominal suffix on, dati, like this, again, the accent would go to the end. And again, you see here that it's an A-class, again, like na'ar. And so we've got to watch out for the R3 guttural there. Okay, now we need to discuss some final considerations. And look at the first final consideration. I talk about the thematic vowels for the call. Again, in some of the weak verbs, you can predict what they're going to be. And so for a Vav, original Vav verb, this is going to be the thematic vowels. A in the perfect, and then the seirei in the imperfect, but a little bit of patach for your second and third feminine plural. And so that's the thematic vowels for that. Now again, if you have a root like yada with a R3 guttural, you're going to have, of course, the problems of an R3 guttural, and we're going to make it all patach. And so we need to watch for that. The next final consideration we want to look at is the Vav consecutive form. If we go back one more time at the imperfect, remember your original Vav quiesces, and we lengthen by compensation the preformative. Now when we put the Vav consecutive on, what will happen is we'll have a retraction of stress. And once we retract the stress, the last syllable being closed and accented Hebrew requires a short vowel. And so we'll get a segol there, and we'll say vayeshev. And again, this will be for forms without vocalic endings. If we were to go to a plural, we wouldn't have this. The accent would not shift. We would have something like this, vayeshavu. So again, it has to be like a 3MS or a 3FS, a form like that, where there's no vocalic ending at the end. And then what will happen is, again, the accent will shift, and with the shifting of the accent, the original thematic vowel seirei will reduce in a closed unaccented syllable. So you want to keep that in mind. And again, this can happen not just in the call, but this can also happen, as I list there, in the hifil and in the nifal at times also. So again, you want to keep those in mind. The next final consideration for these verbs is the verb halach. The verb halach, a very common verb in Hebrew, meaning to walk, is really frequently an original Vav verb. So you'll see many forms that really reflect the original Vav nature of it. And again, as you look at it for your call perfect 3ms, it retains the hey as opposed to the yod. But when you get to the call imperfect and the call imperative, the infinitive construct, and you can see in the hifil also, you can see the original Vav manifesting itself. So again, that is the R1 yod original Vav. And now we want to move on, if you look at section 6, to the R1 yod original yod. And in that introduction there, you can see that I list the verbs that most frequently occur in Hebrew. And again, these are all pretty rare. And so really the original Vav is much more common than the original yod, but yet at the same time they occur enough that we really do need to take them seriously. And again, the original yod will have virtually the same problems. Namely, yod in certain positions will have a tendency to either contract or again to quiesce. So that's going to be our problems. That's going to be the weaknesses or the sicknesses. Strong areas, again, like the original Vav verbs, there are certain places. I list here the call perfect, imperative, infinitives, and participles. If you look at those forms again, you'll see that they're very regular. They should cause you no problem. But in other areas, they will give you problems. And again, we're going to look at the hifil first. So look at section 9. The hifil, again, is really a hafil. And so let's look at a form. Okay, we're looking at really a hifil, perfect, but it really is a hafil. And you can see this is what the original form would look like. But you've got this I, and of course your accent's over here. And so this I is, again, a contraction that we've seen many times. I will go to A. And so when this contracts out, we're going to get the seire yod like this. And so this is, again, the contraction, AY becoming a seire yod. And that's what we see here. Okay, so we need to watch for that. Again, if we were to go to the imperfect, all we would do is replace the hey performative with an aton letter, as you know. All right, so again, look for that contraction. When we look at the Vav consecutive, by the way, remember the Vav consecutive of the hifil is, of course, a special seire form. So let's put the seire here. And when we put the Vav consecutive on it, let me rewrite this. When we put the Vav consecutive on, again, it will have the tendency to pull the accent. And so when the accent's pulled, that leaves the final syllable again in the closed, unaccented position. Hebrew requires a short vowel. And again, you'll get the sagol like we saw with Vayeshev with the original Vav verbs. So watch for that also. Okay, and now for the call. And by the way, I'm only discussing the hifil and the call because that's the only that's basically all that occurs in. The original yod verbs usually occur, you'll see them only in the hifil and the call. If you do see a rare form in the nifal or so forth, you'll be able to handle it, I believe. But let's look at the call now. In the call imperfect, the form would originally look something like this. But again, as you look at that, you should get, you should become love is in the air, because that's the typical situation for the Hebrew love story. And so what happens is the yod quiesces, the second yod quiesces and becomes the vowel hirik yod. And so what we end up with again is the Hebrew love story, yitav, like this. And so here in the call, the yod, and imperfect, the yod is quiescing and becoming a vowel. So we want to watch for that. Now, final considerations for these original yod verbs, and that is the thematic vowels. The thematic vowels for them in the call are always read, always patach, and therefore you want to keep that in mind. And so really these act more like stative verbs, so keep that in mind. All right, now we want to go to mixed forms. And so for the mixed forms, I want you to look at the chart that you have in the back of the chapter. And I want to show you two forms in particular. I want you to look at yare, and of course it's doubly weak. You can see it's got a yod on the front, and that will represent an original yod and original vav this time. That's why it's mixed. And then the other weakness, of course, is the final aleph. And also the word yarash. Again, this is not doubly weak here, but again, it will alternate between an original vav and an original yod. And so sometimes with these two verbs, sometimes they act like original vav verbs. At other times, they act like original yod verbs. And so, again, they're mixed in their form. So let's look at yara. And again, you need to look at your book for this. Notice that in the call, yare here, all the way down, is really original yod. Now, it has an irregular infinitive construct, yir'ah, that you need to memorize. You need to know that. But really, all the forms here in the call are R1 original yod. But when you get outside the call, when you get to the derived conjugations, and the example I give you here is a nifal, if you'll notice here, it's an original vav verb. It's not original yod, it's original vav. And so the form is mixed, and so you want to keep this in mind. When you come to yarash, the mixture is even a little more complicated. If you notice in the imperfect, it is an original yod verb. But when you get to the imperative and when you get to the infinitive construct, they're actually original vav verbs. And again, here's the mixture. And when you get out into the derived stems, again, it's an original vav verb. And so these verbs are mixed, and because of that, you need to take note of these. These two verbs in particular are very common in Hebrew, and therefore you want to make sure that you really know these verbs well. If you look now at section 13, I discuss the verbs that are R1 yod, but also R2 sadi. And again, I list the ones that occur, and there's one in particular that you do not want to put in this class or this category, and that's yasa. Do not put that in this category. But these verbs that I'm giving you here, like yasag and others, really want to act like the yod is an original nun. And so really with these particular verbs, you're going to treat them as if they were R1 nun verbs. And therefore you're going to have assimilation in the call imperfect. And so if you look at section 13 here, if we could focus in close on this. If we look at section 13, you can see this is what the original form would look like. And then in the next form here, you can see the assimilation of the yod, which again is acting like a nun. And, but the second one in particular is very difficult to explain. You can see in the next example, you have the imperative of 2ms, but you can have either yasok or you can simply have sak. Notice that even the thematic vowel changes here. And this is very difficult to explain. Obviously, this is just extremely difficult. Exactly why, apparently there was a biform here. There was one form that had the holum for a thematic vowel and another form that had a patach. Maybe this is a dialectical difference, who knows. But again, that this would change is very difficult. But again, these verbs really do act as if they are nuns. And so when you look at these verbs, like the example I give again, I want to show it to you one more time. When you look at this verb, yasok, like this yod here really is acting as if it was a nun, and therefore it assimilates into the sadi. So these verbs, again, have to be watched carefully. They're not extremely common, but they're common enough that they can trip you up, and so we, again, have to look at it. Notice the infinitive construct. Notice again, it's following a seglet pattern, and therefore the original yod this time is leaving. We're adding a T, we're going through the seglet process, and so forth. And again, this is like an original nun, as I give you an example there of geshet from Nagash. And so watch for that. And then I give you the hifil imperfect, and there again we are assimilating the yod, and you say yasiku. Let's draw that out here. Yasiku. And this yod here is the yod that should have been R1 is assimilated into the sadi. And so again, these are a special class that you need to take attention to. Now there's one other verb that we need to look at, and that's an irregular verb, yachol. This verb is very common in Hebrew, and therefore we again need to note this one. Notice the holem thematic vowel here in the perfect, and in the imperfect you're going to have the patach as the thematic verb. But notice how it's written. Notice the first syllable. You get yuchal. And of course some of the old grammars view this really as a hafal, being a hufal with contraction as we saw with the original vavs. But most dictionaries now and grammars, I think, would see this as an irregular call imperfect. And so this form is very common in Hebrew. You need to take note of it. It's basically a memorization form because it's so irregular, but very common. So keep an eye on it. It means to be able. You know, obviously it will take oftentimes an infinitive construct after it to complete its meaning. Now if you look at section 15, we're going to form and we're going to parse these verbs. And with the R1 weakness, obviously it's going to be the first part of the verb. It's going to be the boxes that are going to have to be altered. And so let's look at the first one. We have a hifil imperative to MP of yasha. And by the way, I just write yasha like this. And when I write it like this, it's an original vav. If it's an original yod, I'd put a yod in brackets or in parentheses like this. And so that's when I write it like this, I'm telling you it's an original yod. And if you look at number 2, you'll see an example of that. But if I have it without this, you're to assume it's an original vav. Again, that's the more common. And so that's why we just leave it like this. And so let's do it. Let's first look at the boxes. And we've got to remember with these forms, now the hifil is really a hafil. So even if this were a perfect, we would want to really go to this here with the patach under the performative hey. So it's really a hafil. And so when we plug in the original vav, this is what's going to create the problem because ow is going to go to o. And so we're going to have to change our box to look like this. And so that's going to be our beginning. And so again, I want you to follow all the steps, but for me, I'm just going to have to shorten it up a little. So let me put it down like this. Okay, of course, the next step is the colors. And you remember your colors for your hifil looks like this. And again, this is the imperfect imperative. We're looking at the long Hirik Yod here. If I were to ask for the 2ms, then we would have a special Seirei form. But we're not asking for that, so we can go with the Hirik Yod here, like this. And then we need the call. And of course, the call form, I have there Shimru. And what we're wanting is that ending. So we're wanting this ending here, of course, with the hifil. The accent likes to stay with the thematic vowel. And so really this is our answer. Hoshi'u is our answer. And again, make sure you look over that and understand that contraction at the front of the word. Okay, number 2, I give you a call imperfect 3ms of an original yod verb, yatav. And again, I'm asking for a call imperfect. So first we want to make it strong. And so the first thing we want to do is make it strong. We'll leave the, we'll make it like a yiktol form just to start with. But what I'm interested in is the first part of it, the first syllable, because there's where the problem is going to be. And in this situation, again, you should immediately recognize that love is in the air. And so we're going to contract this out. And, well, not contract out, we're going to quiesce it. And this is going to become a vowel here, a Hirik Yod. And so that's going to be our first part. The verb is a original Yod. And so you're supposed to know the thematic vowels of an original Yod. They're like stative verbs. So we'll go ahead and get rid of that and put the patach here. And then again, it's a 3ms, and so we don't need to adjust our aton letter in any way. And so really, this is our answer, yitav. This is the answer. So that is that problem there. Now for parsing, if you look at the parsing problem we have, let's go ahead and write that. Here's the word that we're parsing. And again, we want to do boxes, colors, call. And as we look at this, clearly the boxes have been obscured. And when you see this R1-Vav, again, immediately I become somewhat suspicious. We very well could be looking at contraction. Now we have to be careful here because it may not have contracted. We could be looking at the R1-Vav, or we could be looking at the holum written fully for a call participle. We always got to take that in consideration. But the problem is the stemmatic vowel here being patach. You would expect a seire with a furtive patach. So really the idea of a call participle doesn't look favorable. And especially with the hay on the front. When I see that hay on the front, that is a preformative of a hifil. And so it'd be easy to explain this as coming from a hafil construction, if you please, like this. And so I do see a box. And so I'm going to go ahead and assume we have some type of hafil, hifil box. So really, we could have a perfect here. We could have not an imperfect because we'd get not a hay, but some type of performative, aton performative. You could be looking here at a imperative. You could be looking at some type of infinitive. But again, not a participle because we'd expect a mem performative for that. So those are sort of our options. And so that's the first step. The next is, of course, the colors. And the colors that you would expect are these. That's part of the colors. But remember, we also said that we could be looking at some type of infinitive. And so with infinitives, remember, you can get a seire or you can get a hierarch yod. So any of these forms are possible. Now, we're going to have a problem, and that is we have a doubly weak verb here. We have a final guttural, and therefore any type of seire would be changed. And so really we can pretty much discount any of these threes in the perfect. We can really discount any of these hierarch yods. We might as well get rid of all the hierarch yods. We're looking at probably some type of seire form. Now, it's possible patach, but the problem with that is we would, if we go to the call, if we go to the perfect, the problem is we'd have to have something other than a third person. And this could only be a 3ms, but